Hmm.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Rokar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars. Today, we have Professor Emily Michelson with us, who is the Professor of History at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. And she's going to talk about her most recent book that came out in 2022, titled Catholic Spectacle and Rome's Jews. Professor Michelson, thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I know we were looking forward to having you for a talk on your new book last year. That didn't work out, so we're so happy to have you this year. And thank you so much for spending your time with us for the next hour.
Thank you, Nagar. It is a real pleasure to be here. So I want to thank you for hosting, and I would like to thank you for the invitation to participate in the intellectual life of the Medici Archive Project.
Of course.
Just sharing my screen. There we go.
Thank you.
And also to thank the audience for coming along to hear about this book, especially those of you who are in the UK or perhaps elsewhere in Europe, where it is already practically tomorrow. So I want to start by setting a scene while I also try to get my PowerPoint working on my screen. Hold on. Nagar, can you confirm that you see my PowerPoint screen?
Yes, we see full screen of your slide.
Okay.
Yes.
It's being a little weird now on my side, but it'll be fine. Right. So ignore all that and we'll set a scene. I want you to imagine that it is Saturday afternoon, say in around 1610, and we are in the oratory of the grand architectural complex built by the Archconfraternity of the Most Holy Trinity, Santissima Trinità dei Pellegrini. The sides of the vast oratory are crammed with Christian spectators. The room is packed so tightly that some people have to cluster near the door or cannot enter at all. Many more people have lined the streets outside. The cardinals in attendance presumably are given comfortable seating, but the rest of the viewers are all on their feet. In the center of the hall, a scattering of benches has been set up for about 250 Roman Jews, currently progressing along the streets that lie between the gates of the ghetto and the door of the oratory to attend the mandatory conversion sermon, because that is the event I'm describing. Once they arrive, they must give their names to a guard at the door who will check them against his list before they can take their seats. The guard is often a convert himself. He is acquainted with the arriving crowd and will know immediately if anybody on the required rota for that week has skived off or sent a substitute in his stead. A special carpeted area awaits the catechumens and neophytes, so the newly baptized or those studying for conversion, who have been conveyed to the oratory from their new Christian dormitories. In theory, the catechumens and neophytes have come to further their own religious education, but their presence also signals to the crowd, both Christian and Jewish, that conversion is possible, and more specifically, that conversion preaching can work. Once they have been seated, the Jews of Rome can potentially study the grand and recently installed altarpiece painting showing the Pope Gregory Mass, if the curtain that usually hangs over it has been pulled back. That is unlikely, but I really hope that sometimes it was pulled back, because this painting provides a stunning piece of visual propaganda for the moment of a conversion sermon. Although it depicts a historical scene, the painting is set in the as yet unfinished New St. Peter's of the 1570s and is crowded with contemporary portraits. The Jewish people in the oratory could hypothetically gaze directly at the recognizable face of the man responsible for bringing them there, Pope Gregory XIII, whose legislation established these mandatory conversion sermons in Rome, and who also served as the painter's model for his saintly namesake. Below him in the painting, the former cardinal protector of the confraternity who had commissioned it, Ferdinando de' Medici, regards the viewer with a stern expression, surrounded by a cluster of sumptuously dressed cardinals and confraternity members. The confraternity of the Most Holy Trinity was by this time extraordinarily renowned and well on its way to becoming the largest confraternity in Rome, with approximately 3,000 members, or 3% of the population of the city, and about equal to the size of its Jewish population. The oratory, built 40 years earlier, is now well appointed, but it has been adapted to the occasion. If there is a monstrance covering the Blessed Sacrament, it has been removed. The guard at the door waits with his truncheon to pounce on any Jewish misconduct. He will continue to beat any Jewish people who misbehave, grumble, or seem not to be listening. When everyone is settled, the preacher comes in. He begins with a genuflection and a personal prayer in a low voice, hands folded, eyes devoutly heavenward. These actions are familiar to the Christian onlookers from their own sermons. But in this case, the preacher prays not only for divine guidance, but specifically that his words should lead the Jews to conversion. He omits the usual pre-sermon formulas and Ave Marias, which he would otherwise have spoken aloud, out of fear that the Jews might blaspheme the names of Jesus and Mary upon hearing them. At last, he turns to his audience. Although he is speaking in front of both old and new Christians, it is the anticipated future Christians he addresses. O Jews, he begins, not only our sainted doctors preached the excellencies of Christ, but so did your own ancient rabbis as well. Today, I intend to show you how true this is. Under the unforgiving gazes of the painted cardinals, or at least I hope as much for dramatic effect, the rest of the crowd watches and listens as the Jews receive their instructions. The spectacle I have been describing took place almost every week. It took place in public, in front of a mixed audience of Roman Jews, new converts, church officials, confreres of the hosting confraternity, dignitaries, local Romans, and foreign visitors from England, France, and elsewhere. And as I said, it took place weekly from the late 16th century through the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th century, before being finally abolished in 1847. In other words, the tightly scripted performance of conversion preaching that we have just recreated held an important place in the Catholic Church's triumphalist revival in the early modern period. In the book that I'm discussing tonight, I argue that this ceremony became a crucial and unique platform for defining and defending the early modern Catholic Church during an era of its profound transformation. So for context, we're in the religious renewal of 16th and 17th century Rome, a period when the Roman Church had survived centuries of threats, most recently the Protestant Reformation and the devastating Italian Wars, and had emerged largely triumphant. By the end of the 16th century, the papacy was firmly established in Rome, it was extremely wealthy, and it had recently concluded a major council which would seek to set the church on a new, stricter path. So it's in a period of growth and revival. The ecclesiastical elite of early modern Rome deliberately sought to make the city of Rome into a living model of Christian virtue, symbolized in part by the rebuilding of St. Peter's, both physically, so we're talking about remaking the city both physically and spiritually, recasting it as a fitting global capital for a religion that was moving beyond Europe and taking root on 5 continents. Refashioning Rome into a beacon of piety meant, in part, imposing new measures intended to either segregate or integrate outsiders who did not fit the city's pious image, in particular, prostitutes, paupers, and Jews, whose numbers all increased in Rome in the 16th century. In that context, attention to Jewish-Christian interaction in Rome is profoundly revealing. Rome boasts the oldest continuous Jewish community in Europe. Christianity in Rome first developed around its pre-existing Jewish community, which never left. Jews had lived in Rome from ancient times, dating their origins there to the 2nd century BC. In Rome, Jews had always been tolerated and protected. They also enjoyed an uncommon level of privilege, partly through the antiquity of their community, and partly thanks to a history of special dispensations for services to the papacy, which earned them legal protection and discouraged forcible conversions. So the long Middle Ages saw an extended period of relative tolerance, stability, and civil relations between Jews and others in Rome. But the 16th century witnessed enormous transformation for Rome's Jews. Their numbers swelled as they absorbed refugees from the Spanish and Portuguese expulsions in the late 15th century, and they became pawns in a much more widespread battle for souls after the Reformation. Jews in Rome were therefore intimate outsiders, an infinitely useful phrase from Tom Cohen. In an era of the Reformation, when lay people in Europe could, at least in theory, choose among Christian confessions for the first time, the battle for hearts and minds was paramount. Its chief weapons were instruction, catechism, and supervision. In that context, Jewish conversion was especially prized. As the oldest antagonist, it offered the greatest validation. So relations between Jews and Christians in the Counter-Reformation circled ever more narrowly and focused ever more closely around conversion. At the same time, public events aimed at converting Jews were not invented in the 16th century. Theological differences between Christians and Jews had become an increasingly public matter over the late Middle Ages. Public disputations included the Maimonidean controversies of the early 13th century, the Paris Talmud burning of 1240, the Barcelona disputation of 1263, and famously the early 15th century disputation at Tortosa, which lasted for nearly 2 years and saw mass conversions alongside constraints and attacks on Jews. In an era of growing concern about heresy and orthodoxy, these debates sought to demonstrate that Jewish texts could prove the superiority of Christianity if read correctly. The medieval disputations, in particular, incubated a growing tradition of conversionary or polemical literature called adversus Judaeus literature, composed by mendicants and converts, most notably the Dominicans Raymond of Peñafort and Ramon Martí, and the convert Paul Christiani. These texts also helped to establish the default rhetoric and content for later conversion literature. Their tactic was to read and reinterpret biblical and rabbinic texts, so the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the Midrash, so as to argue that such texts actually supported Christian doctrine. Medieval disputations and an increasing number of occasional public sermons formed the backdrop and the launching pad for our subject today, the new spectacle of regular conversion preaching in early modern Rome. The real novelty of this event, then, is the establishment of sermons as a recurring and lasting public event. They took place weekly, as we've seen, on Saturday afternoons, and they were held in a space that was made open to spectators. The combination of predictable repetition and prestigious location turned these sermons into a fixture on the Roman devotional circuit. It's important to note, it's critical to note, that these sermons always had multiple audiences. That was a built-in expectation of their structure from the start, that they would be public. So the room included Jews, potential Jewish converts, local Romans, as I've said, grandees, and also crucially visitors from abroad. Montaigne, Anthony Munday, Gregory Martin, John Evelyn, and many more have written about their attendance at these sermons. In fact, public sermons to Jews enhanced two common itineraries for which Rome was already famous among foreigners: Jewish ethnographic tourism, which Yaakov Deutsch has studied, and Roman devotional topography and sacred networks, as studied by Barbara Wish and Simon Ditchfield, among others. And my work on this aspect of these sermons has established that for many such visitors, sermons to Jews as a distinctively Roman spectacle became a key feature of their visit that defined the entire city in the eyes of foreigners and became a point of pride for devout Catholic residents. Naturally, the setting of such an event would profoundly shape the impressions left on these audiences and could not be left to chance for a staged spectacle such as this. The sermon's placement in a prestigious Catholic setting, well away from the crowded ghetto, was crucial. It was important that all audiences, Jewish, converting, local, or foreign, encounter sights, spaces, and sounds that suggested the sure and triumphant growth of Catholicism. And I've sort of blown up the ghetto area on that map, superimposed on the other map. I want to point you also to some important new findings in my work on these sermons. One is the existence of a vastly larger source space than we previously thought. So scholars had for a long time been aware of the evidence of some late 16th and early 17th century printed sermons or treatises by preachers to Jews, such as the ones shown here, as well as some 18th century material. But it turns out that the gap in the middle was largely covered, much of it was covered by one preacher, Gregorio Boncompagni Corcos degli Scarinci, who delivered weekly sermons to Jews for 39 years, starting in 1649, and who compiled 10 giant volumes of sermon manuscripts, which he passed on to his friend, Giovanni Pastrizio, who was a Hebrew professor at the Congregation of Propaganda Fide, the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. I'm specifically mentioning Propaganda Fide, then housed in this lovely building, because Boncompagni's documented collaborations with Pastrizio and other scholars show how conversion sermons formed part of a third Roman itinerary, the itinerary of intellectuals and elite institutions which prioritized Hebrew study and which formed their own network. These included the Vatican Library, the Sapienza University, and the Propaganda Fide and similar missionary congregations. Their involvement reminds us that for all the flash and drama of these sermons, they were also considered intellectually prestigious and were meant to contribute to the city's scholarly credentials. And we see that in part with Boncompagni leaving his manuscripts to Pastrizio at Propaganda Fide. The many thousands of pages of Boncompagni's manuscripts tell us a great deal about how the sermons functioned as an event. One sermon has a note next to the full text saying, for example, the whole sermon is written out, and then in the margins it says, this sermon was not delivered because it was raining. We also find that Boncompagni is obsessively interested in justifying the ongoing presence of a Christian audience. As the importance of spectators grew, the question of Christian attendance at conversion sermons became the subject of deliberate discussion. And Boncompagni is deeply concerned with the Christian audience. He says explicitly that the sermons are also for them, that they exist in order to teach Christians doctrine that they should already know, but couldn't be taught because they were things that they needed to know, but couldn't be taught because they were supposed to already know it. He says this explicitly, and I want to point out that the papal bull establishing conversion sermons is very specific about what the sermons are supposed to do and say, and Boncompagni is tearing up the rule book. He is ignoring this legislation in order to preach specifically to Catholics at sermons to Jews. So he gives sermons addressing the question of why Catholics should attend these sermons. He gives reflections on what a genuine conversion is, and he uses the sermons to teach basic Catholic doctrine to both Jews and Catholics who are present, bringing in really recent contemporary topics, which again is far outside of his brief. So he preaches, for example, a sermon on Francis Xavier when Francis Xavier is canonized, and on Rose of Lima when Rose of Lima is beatified. And then he preaches a sermon on what devotion to saints really is and why it matters. So he's providing a Catholic education for Catholics via the medium of teaching these topics to Jews. This is, in large part, an attempt to create and justify a post-Reformation, post-Council of Trent Catholicism that is fit for a new early modern era. He uses sermons to Jews as a way to think through and express in public what it means to be Catholic in the 17th century and how that is different from in the past. Another thing that we learn from Boncompagnie's manuscripts is that they form a key link in the identification of an ongoing practice of Jewish resistance to sermons. And this is another new finding. So, for example, in this slide, Boncompagnie writes, "This sermon was first done by me, Gregorio. It is worth nothing. It was pure practice. The Jews negated it with total ease, although they only knew the basics of the gospel, which they reject." What you're looking at here is a phrase added in his own hand by an elderly Boncompagnie who was reviewing his earlier manuscripts. And his offhand comment suggests that it was standard practice for the Jewish audience to refute the content of the weekly sermon. And this is confirmed in other places in Boncompagnie's oeuvre, which contain marginal notes regularly about the repeated refutation of the preacher's proselytizing messages. These notes form a link between earlier evidence that we had of passive resistance and deliberate misbehavior and a later form of formal written objections to the content of sermons. Together, they show that Jews in Rome were never passive subjects of anti-Jewish violence, but active resistors whose determination shaped the sermon spectacle. Indeed, Boncompagnie argues forcefully for keeping the Christian audience in the room on a permanent basis, precisely because he thinks that would help keep the Jews in line and better behaved and more docile. Such resistance is especially important to note, considering all of the ways that the sermon spectacle was designed to subjugate its first audience. Jewish resistance took place in the face of an entire constellation of hostile anti-Jewish legislation. In the decades on either side of the launch of forced sermons, Rome also instituted public Talmud burnings, the imposition of distinguishing signs on Jewish clothing, restrictions on Jewish professional options, the establishment of the Roman ghetto, the launch of a school and boarding house for potential converts, often offered or forced by their relatives, and another one for potential conversion preachers, and the impoverishing launch of the Monte di Pietà, or Christian Loan Bank, which was specifically designed to undermine Jewish economic stability. Monte di Pietà were established in town after town in northern Italy over the 16th century and 17th, encouraged by rabble-rousing preachers and typically presaging an uptick in anti-Jewish violence leading to expulsion from region after region. In Rome, when Roman Jews processed from the ghetto to the oratory in advance of a conversion sermon, they passed directly by the confreres of the confraternity led the Jews along the city's main processional route. And after 1603, the procession went directly by the piazza that showcased the grand new palace of Rome's Monte di Pietà, which, as I said, was a Christian charitable loan bank instituted specifically to extirpate Jewish, supposedly usurious money lending. And here you can see just the scale of this palace, how big it is from the perspective that Jews on their way to a sermon would have seen it as they walked by, only without the cars. In addition, along the route, edicts were posted forbidding anyone under threat of heavy fines or torture from harassing or inciting violence against the Jews going to, during, or returning from the conversion sermon. Clearly an ongoing problem. We have many, many copies of these edicts in the archives. Indeed, heavy snowfall could cause a sermon to be canceled, not because it made walking difficult, but to, and I quote here, avoid the inconveniences and molestations done to the Jews by Christians throwing snowballs, according to a record in the archives of the Roman Vicariate. My work argues that sermons were simultaneously a point of civic and also intellectual pride for a city in the midst of renewal, and at the same time, the smokescreen or the pretty face that masked a much darker and more violent anti-Jewish campaign. The two stories I'm going to tell now both show this dialectic, and crucially, so do the afterlives of these stories. I sometimes refer to them as upsetting stories, both because they are unpleasant and because they upset simple narratives about triumphalism. The first story is the best known. It is the story of a man called Prospero di Tullio Serampino, who was a Roman Jew and the father of 5, who found himself in chance conversation one day with a Dominican friar called Giovan Domenico Nazareno. This is in the late 1630s. The friar asked Prospero about his children. They're chatting. Would he consider making any of them Christian? No, he wouldn't. Nazareno keeps asking, keeps describing the great benefits of a Christian life, the care and comfort that a baptized child would receive, and Prospero keeps refusing. Finally, the friar asked, well, what if the Pope himself conducted the baptism? And Prospero, who at this point is clearly fed up with the conversation, offered this specific response. He says, if this is so, I'll give him to you, for God wants me to give him to you. The documentary manuscript record emphasizes that these were the exact words he used, noting them so carefully that the handwriting becomes more precise, and in later printed versions, the words are underlined or italicized. Nazareno knew that he only had this one chance and acted immediately. He told Prospero that the hasty statement was binding. He roped in bystanders as witnesses. You saw what he said. Prospero immediately said, no, he hadn't meant it. He was just being rhetorical. But Nazareno insisted that it was binding. He pulled every string he could. He took the case to the rector of the catechumen house. The rector immediately consulted the conversion preacher to the Jews at that time, whose name was Giuseppe Ciantes. Ciantes determined that Prospero's sarcastic resort was in fact a legally binding promise. From there, the case circled up to the catechumen's cardinal protector and then to the Pope. Urban VIII, Pope Barberini, agreed with delight to baptize one of Prospero's children personally. Over Prospero's repeated protests, the rector of the House of Catechumens, with some henchmen and potentially also the preacher, raided the Serampino household in the ghetto in the middle of the night and emerged with 2 children, a 13-month-old girl called Gemma and a boy called Solomon, who seemed to be about 6. The Jews of Rome rallied around Prospero, angry enough to turn the city upside down. The record describes them as mad dogs howling. The boy, Solomon, was lavished with attention within the catechumen house. He got to sleep in his own bed, and he seemed to agree to convert. The rector strategically reassessed his age to at least 7, the age of reason. In response to strenuous ongoing Jewish protests, a group of Catholic officials reviewed the case, but confirmed, predictably, that both children still merited baptism. Baby Gemma would fulfill her father's hasty promise. Solomon, now considered old enough, was said to be converting of his own volition. The Catholic figures involved saw this incident as a shining example of Urban VIII's benevolence. The papal baptism merited an elaborate ceremony in the Dominican Church of the Minerva, where the priest Nazareno, the one who'd had the original conversation, was based. The children, now renamed Anna Urbania and Urbanus Urbanius, wore white, silver, and gold wool. The crowds overflowed. the little boy was mounted on the Pope's own white horse in a triumphal procession, followed by carriages, drums, and trumpets. The procession proceeded directly through the ghetto itself and then around much of Rome. The two children were then sent off to Catholic settings and would not have seen their families again. In some ways, this story is clearly extraordinary. Compared with other records, it stands out for the curious circumstances of the offerta, or the offering of relatives for baptism, and for its violence and drama. The story in manuscript appears in the record book of 17th century adult baptisms, now housed in the archives of the Roman Vicariate. It is the only extended narrative in the book. All the other entries merit only 2 or 3 lines. The rector who recorded the story proudly noted his own role in the action, saying, "The friar came to me, Remedio Albano, rector." To him, it demonstrated the confusion of the cursed and obstinate Jewish rabble and praise of the omnipotent triune God and the glorious Virgin Mary and the holy and triumphant militant church. But in equally important ways, this is not a unique case. It is part of a general pattern, one slightly unusual incidence in Rome's sweeping conversionary campaign. For example, the baptism of these 2 children was part of a regular series of baptisms of Jews and Muslims throughout the early modern period. The same suffragan bishop who was present at their baptism baptized converts on a regular basis. He had done 2 a month earlier and would baptize 2 more a month later. Cardinals and even popes had performed extraordinary baptisms before and would again. But this story helps us to understand why Jewish conversion mattered so much to Catholics in Rome. And we can see this in part by looking back at the Friar Nazareno and his later actions with regard to the conversion preacher in this case, Giuseppe Ciantes. It turns out that the 2 men had a history. A year later, a year after this incident, Nazareno published a new edition of this anti-Jewish tract on the left, which had been written by an earlier conversion preacher, giving it a new dedication to Ciantes himself, the current conversion preacher. And in Nazareno's letter of dedication, he celebrates Ciantes's, and I'm quoting, "glorious efforts over the course of so many years in Rome in the holy preaching of the true faith and the conversion of Jews and other infidels." But it's not just about Jews here. Nazareno was nicknamed the Armenian for his own origins. His letter also recalls his experience as a convert to Latin Rite Roman Catholicism in the catechumen house, I think in Venice, and the kindness that Ciantes had shown him then. He brings up his own plans to return to Armenia, saying that he wanted to commit himself totally to the conversion of souls following the example of Ciantes. He mentions the many people who are zealous for the propagation of the faith who had asked him to republish this pamphlet. So in saying this, he is evoking the congregation of the same name, Propaganda Fide, which had recently been founded to coordinate global missionary efforts. In short, Nazareno shows us how the campaign to convert Jews in Rome also fed into the Roman Church's expanding global mission. The general celebration of conversion was already and would remain a priority in early modern Rome. This story, a chance conversation between a friar and a father, ultimately ropes in almost the entire early modern city, revealing the Catholic network of individuals and institutions that powered the wheels of conversion. The Dominican and other religious orders, the House of Catechumens, conversion preachers, popes, cardinal patrons, and the Congregation of Propaganda Fide. And the story would go on to become a valuable legal precedent in instances of contested baptism. The rector's narrative was printed up verbatim and incorporated into later collections of cases of contested baptism, where it regularly reappears over the next 150 years. Copies of it also show up elsewhere in other archives, in Inquisition archives, and across the city. It has become one of the most retold stories in the Jewish history of Rome. The second story came only a decade or so later, and it involves a pig at a funeral. This is the story that opens the book, if you have looked that far in. The funeral marked the passing of a famous and learned rabbi in Rome, Rabbi Tranquillo Vita, or Cheskia Manoach, Korkos the Elder, who died in the late 1640s. Funeral processions provided one of the few occasions when Christians could observe large groups of Jews gathered together outside the ghetto for their own purposes, rather than to fulfill one of the many ceremonial roles foisted on them by the city. Jewish funeral processions were always accompanied by the threat of violence. At this funeral, the violence appeared courtesy of a conversionary polemicist of exceptional zeal, Melchior Palontroti. Palontroti had a particular beef with Tranquillo Korkos, the chief rabbi, who was widely known as our teacher, Morenu, or our rabbi. Palontroti did not simply seek to disrupt Korkos's funeral, but took a coarse and satirical approach. He organized a mock procession of young men to counter the funeral procession of mourners. At the head of the counter procession, corresponding to Korkos's coffin, was the box containing a live pig. At intervals, the box was opened, the boys sang a song, and the pig stuck his head out. I don't need to go into the fact here that at no point in history did anybody just happen to choose a pig to insult a Jewish group. It was a very deliberate choice. So the funeral procession processed, and every time it paused, so did the counter procession. The youths would open the casket and let the pig stick out its head. One of them would shout, "Morenu, our teacher, is in the coffin. Here's the proof." And another might yell, "The big head watches me. His wisdom has swelled even his bones." And another, "Mazal Ra, the soul of a rabbi inside a pig." Palontroti, who organized this event, was an expert in Hebrew language and scripture who had devoted his life to fighting Judaism. At the time of the funeral, he had recently published a decade's worth of angry treatises with a general compendium of anti-rabbinical arguments. He had also stood godfather to at least one convert from Judaism, giving him his own surname on the 9th of February, 1642. Palontroti's aggressive personality comes through in the pig incident and in the fiery titles of some of his compositions. A whip against the obstinacy and stubbornness of the Jews, for example. The manuscript that records this incident tells us that Palontroti liked to hurl abuse at synagogues and that he commonly attended Jewish synagogues in order to interrupt the rabbi and question his interpretation. He composed the song against Rabbi Korkos and taught it to his troupe to sing at Korkos's funeral. The text made full use of Palontroti's expertise as a Hebrew polemicist. The song is in Italian, but almost every one of its 78 lines contains at least one Hebrew word, often a biblical or Talmudic reference. But what I find most striking about this story, dramatic as it is on its own, is the manner in which it has survived. The carefully preserved, emotionally laden story of this song shows that Palontroti was no lone wolf acting alone. Like the actors in the first story, he acted with the approval, tacit or explicit, of a much broader Catholic establishment. The manuscript, which preserves the pig story, was written up by Giovanni Pastrizio, whom we've already met as an influential and well-connected professor of Hebrew at the Congregation of Propaganda Fide. It is preserved in his collected papers. And Pastrizio, as I mentioned before, was a close friend and collaborator of the preacher Gregorio Boncompagni, who taught at the College of Propaganda Fide. A new institution, which, again, represented the Holy See's deliberate mission to proselytize the entire known world in the early modern period, and which considered Hebrew study a necessity for that aim. Pastrizio frames the story by describing Palontroti's skill and erudition, recounting approvingly his history of disruptive actions, and noting that they would set a precedent for later processions mocking Jews. But what most gets Pastrizio's attention is the quality of the scholarship. He transcribes the song itself with exquisite care and meticulous attention to language. Annotations run alongside the lyrics throughout, providing both the Hebrew language original and an Italian translation for every transliterated Hebrew word, each of them numbered and keyed to the translation column. It is bound together, this record, with other sonnets, poems, and odes, as well as material linked to Pastricio's activities as a Hebraist, such as a poem on the Trinity, written in refutation of Judaism by a new convert on the occasion of his baptism. So however carnivalesque Palantrotti's actions with the pig might seem, they come straight from the world of intellectual conversion rhetoric that animates this book and animated much of early modern Rome. And the record of it survives primarily because it impressed Catholic scholars of Hebrew as a literary triumph, even more than a spectacular one. It is the preservation of this story among a set of very scholarly papers that makes it more impossible than ever to distinguish between popular and learned culture, between scholarly theory and violent practice, and between Jewish and global conversion efforts. I find these stories valuable first for understanding how the drive for conversion might play out in individual lives in early modern Rome. The angry polemicists Chantes and Palotrotti, the stolen infants, and even the man who would become rabbinic leader of Roman Jewry in the late 17th century, Tranquillo Vitacorcos the Younger, who was named after his grandfather, whose funeral had been disrupted by a pig, and who became chief rabbi of Rome. It was during Tranquillo Vitacorcos the Younger's Roman childhood that the era of regular resistance to weekly sermons played out, a tradition which seemed to have fueled him to compose more formal treatises against mistreatment at sermons, which he did, and indeed he would become the community's greatest advocate in the early modern period. It's difficult to avoid imagining that, having been raised on the stories of what happened to his grandfather's funeral and what his parents experienced at sermons, it's hard to think that didn't influence him to become an advocate and an emissary as chief rabbi later in his life. These stories also allow us to see conversion preaching in a larger context. They tell us that the purpose of such preaching was not so much the actual conversion as the degradation of the Jews, and more important even, the glorification of Catholicism through the use of its newest, most successful, and most opulent institutions. The grand setting of these sermons and the important institutions that hosted their propagators only reinforces this point. And so does the later history of sermons. As they became less prominent over the 18th century, conversion sermons were moved closer to the ghetto, precisely because they had become less effective and lost some of their spectacularity. The final location, in the Church of St. Angelo in Pescaria, put them practically inside the ghetto, at which point they were only taking place about 5 times a year. Both the setting and the number tell us that the spectacle was over, and what was left was a token effort, a relic from an earlier period in Catholic history when the church was more dominant. By now, we've reached the mid-19th century. Public sermons were only finally abolished for good in 1847 by Pius IX. In their stead, he commissioned a plaque memorializing the sermon. Its placement and text give lie to the idea that persuasion ever really played a role. The plaque sits at an unavoidable entrance to the former ghetto borders, the historical borders of the ghetto, and it bears a passage from Isaiah that says, "I have spread out my hands all the day unto a rebellious people, which walketh in a way that was not good after their own thoughts, a people that provoketh me to anger continually to my face." Although the church had abandoned its grand spectacular undertaking towards Jews, co-opting their movement, physical environment, and audiovisual experience, it left them one reminder that they could not unsee. Finally, these stories have a lesson for us about how religious history gets written. These stories only survived at all because they served the purposes of Catholic self-congratulation at the expense of another population. They show us, as I indicated at the start, exactly how narratives of Catholic triumphalism were constructed and at what price. They show us the tremendous effort that went into editing out other perspectives so strenuously and almost implausibly that we cannot help but see the great silences that remain. And in their jubilation, built on silences, these stories also remind us that all triumphant narratives are based on silences and erasures, and how all religious cultures, even dominant global religions, are inherently shaped by other religious cultures, even smaller disenfranchised ones, whether explicitly or implicitly, both at the time and in the way they later wrote their own history. My book seeks to demonstrate that the organizers of early modern Catholic innovation were deeply concerned both with Jews as people and with Judaism as an idea. And because of that, we should be too. It is impossible to understand early modern Catholicism, both its attention to missions and expansion and its concern for those born Catholic, without paying close attention to the role that Jews and Judaism played in its formation, willingly or not. Thank you.
Thank you for this truly fascinating talk. I was just looking at the slides and then listening to all these narratives, and I think your conclusion actually responded to two of my questions. But with this, I would like to invite our audience to write their questions in the Q&A so I can read them to Professor Michelson. But before that, I would like to start with my own questions, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Thank you. What you narrated basically of the historical documents and your analysis, the majority of them were Catholic narratives, right?
Yes.
So how were these conversions, either like forced and public conversions, were recorded in Jewish narratives?
I'm just writing that down. So we don't have the same kind of consistency of record because they're not a triumph or a thing necessarily worth recording. What we do have are stronger records when there is a contested case or an uncertain case. So, for example, we have letters relating to teenagers who, I'm thinking of specific cases that other scholars have studied, teenagers who ran away and wanted to convert, in the way that you can imagine a 16-year-old sort of storming out of the house and saying, I never want to see you again, and going off to the catechumen house and then thinking better of it. And we have letters concerning cases like that. We have letters, petitions to Rabbi Korkos, the younger, the chief rabbi, asking for help with contested conversion cases. We have letters of advocacy. And there is one very famous case of a woman called Ana Del Monte who spent, I think, 3 weeks in the catechumen house when she was offered there by an ex-fiance and came home again. And nobody thought that she would manage that. And it was a very traumatic case that's been much written about. So we have cases where there is contestation, but we don't have the same kind of triumphalist narratives or even baptismal records. There's no records of people regularly leaving the community because that doesn't get recorded.
Okay. So there were some kinds of resistance, because that leads to my follow-up question about the resistance, and I'm happy that you talked about Tranquilo's case with the rabbi. So how did these the strategies of resistance contributed to the a broader forms of resistance against conversion?
Yeah, so there are a lot of kind of tropes about resistance that when people talk, the parts of conversion preaching that were known to scholars always come with a description of resistance at the beginning. And that includes a lot of passive resistance or sort of general misbehavior. So laughing or talking or spitting or pretending to sleep, or there's this trope about putting wax in your ears so you can't hear the sermon. which I've never seen actual evidence of, but it keeps cropping up. I did once see something about how rabbis would sit in the front row and make signs with their hands to refute whatever the preacher was saying. So perhaps the preacher's holding up 3 fingers and the rabbi's surreptitiously holding up 1 finger, right? That there's no Trinity. And we know that there's this kind of sort of cycle of expectation of resistance because there is a man with a stick walking up and down the sermons, hitting people if they seem not to be paying close enough attention or if they are pretending to fall asleep. And that is absolutely recorded all the way through. One later form of resistance is that Tranquilo Crocos the Younger writes this beautiful letter to the organizers saying, aren't you supposed to convince us by persuasion? How on earth is hitting us with sticks considered persuasion? Don't you know that in the Bible, Moses was told to speak to the rock instead of hitting it? You therefore should speak to us instead of hitting us. Could you stop, please, with the truncheon? And then, so this letter is well known and there exists in a few copies. And then there's a little piece of paper stuck in a book in another archive that says, we got the letter about the truncheon from Rabbi Korkos. We have thought about it and we will continue as before. So it had no influence at all. But what we do see is a sort of gradual pattern that grows from the 16th to the 18th century, where in the 16th century, you have this sort of passive resistance of sermon goers. In the 17th century, you have learned refutation of sermons after the sermon, and that we see in these marginal notes that I showed you, right? It was easy for the Jews to refute this one. And then in the 18th century, we have formal treatises of resistance. And I would also point out that the resistance had an effect, even if the letter about the truncheon was unsuccessful, because Boncompagni writes sermons in response to what the Jewish audience has said about previous sermons. So they've come and said, I didn't like this, this, and this about these sermons. You shouldn't have said it. And then he comes back and writes a sermon saying, this, and this is good doctrine. And let me tell you why, even though you said it wasn't. So there is this kind of interaction that goes on that, as far as I can tell, is only made evident in the marginalia of his sermon records, but is consistent.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. It just keeps getting more interesting. So we have 2 questions from George in the Q&A. The first one is the dedication to Santa Trinita significant in terms of sermon themes and controversies with Judaism and Islam?
So that's Chantes' treatise on the Trinity that I showed at the beginning. It is a little bit, because Chantes at this point, I think, has retired, and he spends his retirement writing theological treatises on points that are disputed between Christians and Jews. So particularly that one, and he's also a mystic. He studied Kabbalah in the tradition of Christian Kabbalists, and he's bringing a lot of that in. So yes, it is a treatise arguing in favor of a Trinity with a polemical undertone, because it is against the Jews, but then at this very sort of high intellectual level. And one of the things that kind of shocked me was to learn that Chantes, whom I had heard of when I first started on this project as very cerebral, very mild in his preaching, right, writes these very erudite things about trinities and celestial spheres, is also a preacher who is involved in rounding up babies for this forced conversion story, that he's right in the middle of that fracas. Or, well, 1 baby and 1 6-year-old. So judging him on his works turned out not to be all of his personality or all of his activities. But yes, there is definitely a Catholic polemical promotion of the Trinity against what he thought were the false beliefs of other religions.
Right. Thank you. And the second question is that I seem to remember part of the papal processions involving the public humiliation of the head rabbi and Torah in the ghetto. Is that true? If so, how related to your amazing themes? And thank you so much.
Yes, it is true. When the Pope takes office, I speak in the present tense, but I mean in the early modern period, when a Pope takes office, he takes possession of his office by this procession called a possesso, where he goes from the Vatican Palace to his palace as Bishop of Rome, St. John Lateran, and that is a processional route. It is lined with decorations and crowds, and there is a section of the route by the Roman Forum that the Jews are compelled to decorate. And there is a ritual where the Pope stops, they hand him a Sefer Torah, the Pope ritually casts it to the ground, which is a desecration, and that ritual persists for a very long time. There are set poems that are read as part of that interaction and set sort of banners and decorations. And George, I can point you to some scholarship on it if you would like. And it is one of a number of rituals that involve Jews in a debased situation in a ritual context in Rome. So there's that. There are the naked races or the barrel races during Carnival. There's the visit to the Roman government where there's a sort of kneeling and foot on the neck ceremony showing Jewish subjugation to the Roman government. And all of these form part of what many scholars have established as a sort of sacred topography in Rome, circuits of pilgrimage or holiness that are meant to sanctify the city. And the ritual subjugation of Jews through ceremony is part of that sort of inscription process.
Right, thank you. And my next question is about images. I'm an art historian. I can't break away from that
Sure.
concern with images. So I know that images were also produced from these conversion scenes, both Jews and Muslims. How widely did these images circulate, and how that contributed to like for the propagandistic purposes of this global mission?
I know very little about images circulating, and if you have more information, I would love to hear it. And I can also point you to the work of my friend and colleague, Kathy Aaron Beller, who has done quite a lot of work on Jewish and Christian images in this period in Italy, and the sort of interactions between them. The only images that I know of the conversion sermon itself is a 18th or 19th century one that's very satirical. So I would
But
love to know what you're
the
thinking.
print that was in the background of your slides, was that a contemporary, like early modern, or it was a later one?
Which one? The
There
map?
was in the background of your slides with Jews kneeling to a like in front of a preacher.
Oh, you mean the one that's the cover of the book?
Yes, yeah. No. The one that it was the background of your slides.
Oh. Oh, this one. Sorry, I'm not, I'm just going to show it to you.
Right.
Do you mean
Yes.
this?
I don't
That's
see
not,
that's not a contemporary.
it is contemporary, but it's not got to do with Jews.
Okay.
Can you see my screen now?
No.
Hold on, I will share it again.
Yes.
That one?
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's my default blank screen, and it is not about Jews per se, but it is a rendition of a sacred pilgrimage, a Catholic pilgrimage within Rome, the pilgrimage to the seven churches.
Okay.
So it helps sort of reinforce the idea that processions and I'm very interested in the walk to the sermon as part of the ritual. And there's quite a lot of scholarship that casts Rome as a sacred landscape that is symbolized by walking and by pilgrimage. And this is the most famous sort of Rome-specific pilgrimage, which has a revival in the same time and is organized by some of the same people. And that's what you're seeing here. Those are devout Catholics kneeling.
So they're not.
Yeah, there aren't Jews in this depiction. But thematically, it's very close to, I would say, the Roman experience of going to a sermon to Jews. They would go to these sermons in the way that they would go on a local pilgrimage, or in the way that they would go hear other preachers in other churches.
Right. Yes. This was comparable to the images of Muslims who converted, and then they are depicted as kneeling in front of the Pope, and then they have their turbans off as a sign of this kind of conversion and breaking away from the Islamic tradition of wearing the Prophet's headgear. But we're running out of time, unfortunately. I myself have several more questions, but I know it is late, especially in Europe and for you, so I don't want to keep you any more than this. I would like to thank you again. This talk was definitely worth the wait, so thank you so much for accepting our invitation. I would like to also say Shana Tova to all those of you who celebrated Rosh Hashanah, and I would like to wish you all a meaningful Yom Kippur. Thank you again for being with us, and thank you each and every one of you for spending the last hour with us. Please join us, same link, same time next week for another talk by Professor Noelia Perez, who is going to give a talk on her recent publication titled Portraiture, Gender, and Power in 16th Century Art. So please join us again next week. Thank you again. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you all so much for coming.
Peace for everyone. Bye-bye. Thank you.